Hello, you've reached Lisa talking again. So, I did that series about what's keeping the UK stable, and I promised you a series looking at what broke Britain, and it's actually very, very, very simple. But making it simple for a video is a bit harder than I thought it would be. Now, I was one of the first generation of children in this country who were classed as a looked after child. So parental responsibility was, for a period of my childhood, well, my teens actually, held by the state. The state had parental responsibility for me. So this was very, 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 very new. There were enormous changes in the 20th century. In the latter half of the 20th century, we developed systems around protection of children. We developed systems where women had to fight, but there are laws about domestic abuse, equality legislation, because women's roles changed. The biggest change to human organisation in history happened in the 20th century, and that was that the family unit ceased to be the breadwinner kind of carer model where women were subordinated and owned within it. And actually, we now just take for granted, completely and utterly, we take for granted that men and women should be equal, that we participate in the labour market, women work. This is not new anymore. This is a generation or so in. Divorce, because we live in a world where actually it's not just that women can leave abuse, but women now in this country are legally obligated, if they have children, to leave abuse. There is an actual obligation on them. And we have legal duties which the state has to abide by, which families have to abide by, around safeguarding children. And it's not just kind of specialists who know these duties. They're so simple that everybody knows them. Schools know them, doctors know them, parents know them. Every parent in the country knows that the welfare of their child, the decision-making of their child, the welfare of their child has to be paramount. This is actually a natural reflection of social change. In the UK, we are a very, very stable country, and we have a rule of law that evolves to reflect social change. We have institutions that reflect social change. Now, one of the problems that we've got in this country is that we have kept, like, our political media system and our policy making system, they actually don't have to be that sophisticated. They didn't have to be that sophisticated because our systems are so stable that they will develop over time. So as well as being one of the first generation of looked after children, I'm also a qualified social worker. In this country, we train lots and lots and lots and lots of people to keep an eye on the bottom line of the rule of law around certain things. Like, this is a social work law book. It's really out of date. But if you look at some of the types of law that are covered in this book, so let's see if we can get to the index, which I probably should have. We have got adult protection, mental capacity legislation, adoption legislation, education legislation, looked after children's legislation, child protection legislation. We have the Human Rights Act, we have discrimination legislation and equality legislation for people where equality is kind of contested and they are treated badly often enough that law has come into being around those people. We have a court system and we have a judiciary system. We have solicitors, we have lawyers, we have judges, we have magistrates, we have police officers. We have lots and lots and lots of different professionals. We have a civil service where they are literally, as part of the conditions of their employment, not allowed to utter an opinion on politics publicly, a bit like the Queen. This is a really clever system, or it was when we had a media landscape, which meant that we had kind of a very small number of newspapers plugged into a very small number of think tanks, devising policy which would then be delivered. It would come apparent through crisis what policy needed to change, what would work and what wouldn't. And the system would naturally stabilise. But the problem is, the difference between maths and economics is that the context changes around economics. And every so often, the context has changed so much that there is a big crisis. And what we do in this country is we train social workers to know this. So for instance, I was trained to understand the institutions that emerged in the post-war period, to understand the structure of those institutions, how they developed until a major crisis in the 70s that triggered the start of what we call neoliberalism, which is the modern way of policy making. Think tanks were established. We had a media landscape with some newspapers at the core, and unfortunately, one of the most stably, reliably reproducing reflexes is the reflex to blame the weakest. And we've had a newspaper culture and an economics which has been, it's kind of emerged into a situation where we weren't actually measuring anything. We were actually using synthetic models which hypothesized how things should be. And then the newspapers were the only thing that anybody had to please. And think tanks were kind of plugged into the newspapers and to government. And this had formed kind of naturally in a stable country over a long period of time. But in the period after the financial crisis, all the problems in this system became apparent because things had changed. These newspapers and think tanks were not aware of the rule of law that has evolved. When I did my book review, I held up this book, which is a battered copy of a book called The Five Giants, a biography of the welfare state. And it's written by a very, very clever man called Nicholas Timmins. And he's written literally a history from 1945 to now. There's actually an updated version of it. And it's literally a history of all the political machinations and all the kind of different governments. Goes through every single government, health, housing, welfare, and it'll tell you quite comprehensively. It's not a book to be read like a novel, although I have read it cover to cover a couple of times. It's actually a very good book so that you can go to any kind of year, like any government, and you can look at what their policy was on a certain area and the difficulties that they ran into. But it's a political biography. It's just about the politics. And the other book that I actually showed you was this one, which is Management in Social Work. And this is written by two women called Veronica Coulshed and Audrey Melenda. And what social work is it's the professionals who have to literally kind of work in the gaps that these people, politicians, can't see in systems that evolve through crisis. Child protection systems, if you ask somebody the history of child protection systems, they will give you the names of some children who were harmed very badly. They will say words, they'll talk about Victoria Climbié, they'll talk about Baby P, they'll talk about the Cleveland Inquiry. Because these are systems that evolve through crisis, and then kind of over a period of time, the political and economic settlement that we're using to shape policy might have shaped them so that they generate crisis, or other crises because society might have changed or something bad happens. And during moments of crisis, systems develop. So unfortunately, in 2006 and 2007, I had been a practicing social worker in the situation that became a public scandal around grooming, around young girls who were being sexually exploited on an industrial scale. And this was only one problem in a wider problem, which was that actually our social care systems and our social work systems around children were failing quite badly. Now, all the social workers in those systems knew why it was. It's because the economics that we'd been using, shaped by these newspapers that nobody reads anymore, this left-right narrative, this nonsense about, with welfare claimants and demonizing them reliably at the core of these narratives, had been shaping systems over a long period of time. We had been heading slowly to a very serious crisis, of which the grooming scandal was just one, where these systems were not meeting the bottom line of the rule of law. But in this country, we train social workers to keep an eye on that and to stand their feet in the ground and face off rage when that's not happening. And actually record the process of doing that so that we can actually use that information to develop new systems. Now, in 2008, there was a financial crisis. And the problem is that the economics that we've been using, well, we train social workers to understand how systems develop, but we hadn't been training economists for about 30 years to know how they kind of came into being. There's a guy called Friedrich Hayek, who most of the people on the right think they're adhering to, and what he said was, if you have a centrally planned welfare system that's shaped by political reflex wrapped around a centrally controlled money supply, eventually that system will kind of expand into your economy and it will exercise control over those people and be used to harm them. And he was talking from the experience of watching his home country, Austria, descend into Nazism and seeing concentration camps. And the warning that is actually most famous for was actually, it started out as a letter to the architect of our welfare system, a guy called William Beveridge, to say this system will do that eventually. And in actual fact, the policy reflex that austerity was about, which was about blaming welfare claimants and public sector workers for the financial crisis, it actually basically vindicated what he had said. But in actual fact, most of the people on the right who think they're adhering to Hayek haven't understood him, and what they're actually adhering is to a man called Milton Friedman. Now, in the late 70s, there were a series of crises. And a woman came to power called Margaret Thatcher, and she was a Conservative Prime Minister. And she had actually, over a period of time, she had noticed that welfare spending and local authority spending were both rising together. But she didn't know that this was a reflection of a change to family structure, that actually women, kind of the family structure had changed from one of ownership to one where women were leaving abuse and saying, actually, this is not acceptable. This was a very new change. And a man called Milton Friedman, his idea was that we could have this kind of economics that Friedrich Hayek had warned about, that would actually just blame welfare claimants for everything and blame single parents for everything. And she had kind of seen this man's ideas and this spending, and she put 2 and 2 together and made 5. But then this had been embedded at the core of our economics for about 30 odd years. Now, we're not a country where people are stupid. We're not a country where we're docile receivers. But also we are a country, every country actually, you can't do much about altering a system until crisis force it. The context changes around economics and generates crisis. So when the financial crisis hit in 2008, what we should have done was asked what context has changed around the economics that we've been using to generate this crisis. And instead what we did is something that civilizations have done throughout history. Our political elite decided that what they would do was just expand the crappy economics that they'd been using, and it was easy enough to demonize welfare claimants and the people covered by this rule of law, the vulnerable people covered by that housing, by mental capacity, by, vulnerable adults, vulnerable children, powerless people, people on using our cash transfer system, claiming benefits, even though welfare spending had expanded to include our working population by this point and was actually reflecting an inflated housing market. The best thing that they could do, I think Labour and the Tories agreed that they were going to save, they were going to, what were they going to achieve? They were going to cut the deficit by attacking these systems, and they were going to achieve savings of something like 20% in, I can't remember what it was, by focusing on social care, on safeguarding, and on our welfare system. And what should have happened is our trade unions, and I was trained under a Labour government to know that this wasn't possible. As the site of political responsibility for these systems under a Labour government, I know that Labour knew this wasn't possible. But Labour didn't know that this wasn't possible. And because one of the other things that had been crucial to our political and economic settlement was the actual dysfunction in the Labour Party, the trade union that represented civil servants who worked in our benefit system had been taken over, had been kind of controlled by an organisation who used to be known as Militant. Dave Prentice and Unison, who should have been saying it's not possible to focus on local authorities in this way, said some cuts were okay as long as these cuts are okay. And Labour had kind of a pattern of kind of manufacturing social movements to prevent kind of people accessing democracy that I didn't know about. And they had basically kept themselves ignorant of how these systems worked. So in the attempt to focus on these systems and to undermine the rule of law, they generated instability. Now, when I started recording this, it was partially because I was a single parent. And I had never been able to utter a public opinion about politics because I'd always been a civil servant or a social worker. We have a Chinese wall system in this country where people who deliver policy do not interrupt political debate. This is very crucial to how democracy functions. But unfortunately, the other thing that had changed, the context that had changed around this economics, was the internet had happened. So when I started talking to people on Twitter in 2010 and Labour were gearing up to create a fake anti-cuts movement, they recruited me. And unfortunately, I got a kind of really, really central view of this process. I did not dream at all. I did not dream. When I just thought I was going to record them trying to deliver austerity, that it would take a couple of years for them to figure out that they couldn't, and then that these systems would consolidate. I did not dream that I would be watching a process that over 10 years meant that our country catapulted itself out of the European Union, that 100,000 people died, and that we would still be sat here 10 years later with these systems in system failure, while actually our economic challenges are this. This is actually worth digressing. We need systems that cross the market sphere, the family, and the care economy. But we have them. Like, our welfare system actually does that. We need systems that warn of overheating in a housing market. We have that. Our housing benefit system does it. We need systems that reflect something called intergenerational reciprocity, the way that time and resources are transferred between generations. We have them. These systems are central to keeping the country stable, have been central to managing coronavirus. But because our political media culture didn't know anything about them, and our economists aren't trained to understand what social workers are trained to understand, they started trying to undermine the rule of law, and this started a chain of events, which unfortunately, if you look at the playlist that I've kind of tucked away, and I don't really like people seeing about the abuse that I received in that 10 years from these cultures, they reacted very badly to hearing that these systems existed. They didn't know. And the problem is that in the process of trying to undermine them, when you undermine the rule of law, you expose your dysfunction. They've exposed all the dysfunction in our other systems, in their systems. We've seen in the last 10 years the dysfunction in our media cultures with Leveson. They've literally been behaving like organised criminals behind closed doors. They've tried to transpose those cultural norms to a digital landscape. We have think tanks which were actually established in the late 70s to actually kind of offset kind of rigidity in other systems, but which have become a very, very serious problem. And we've suddenly got this fossilized media culture without a landscape who are actually plugged into government. But now we've got the situation where, the G7 are discussing Vladimir Putin's ability to use this dysfunction to interfere in democratic processes. So we sit here in 2021 in a country that's catapulted itself out of the European Union. We have a death toll of about 100,000 people. We have a welfare system. Universal credit could never be delivered, but they didn't know this, and they were so busy trying to keep themselves ignorant and create an ignorant bubble around themselves online that they've exposed all their dysfunction. And we've got this welfare system that's cost 20 billion quid, so that any money that could have been saved during austerity has gone on this computer system, and it doesn't work. So what I'm going to do is, that's kind of roughly the situation that's happened. All that's really happened is that kind of systems have developed to reflect social change, safeguarding, the rule of law, welfare systems, equality legislation, laws about domestic abuse. Our rule of law has developed here, but this political media culture actually, and their policy-making culture they're attached to, haven't been able to see it. Now, a guy called Thomas Piketty wrote a book a few years ago, and it got a massive reception, and all he did, honestly, like, this book is just, I've had to read it 4 times. He taught me at the LSE. And all he did was he took one stream of data over a very long time, and he looked at what it said. He analysed it for trends and patterns. We didn't have the technology to do this before. So we needed a belief system like the economics that we've had that could be delivered. The public wanted austerity. The public actually wanted us to lash out at the poorest because it was easier than saying that the economics at the core of their mortgage was a problem. And what we've got is a situation where a country, a stable country, has generated massive instability for itself, jeopardized the global economy, generated a massive death toll, because the context changed around the economics we were using. The economics that a country uses is never about just what's in the economics textbooks. It's about the political landscape, it's about the social landscape, it's about the rule of law, it's about society. The core word of economics is oikos. So what this is really a story. You know, there's a feature in countries where there have been revolutions and wars. In the French Revolution, it was the nobles who would not acknowledge they needed to pay taxes. In the Russian Revolution, there were many attempts to kind of get the nobles to kind of adjust, and they wouldn't. And it resulted in the situation, with the situation that led to the end of the imperial system in China. It was the mediating class. The question about stability comes down to how quickly can your mediating class, the class that are closest to power, in our country it would be the LSE, the Guardian, the Labour Party, how quickly can they adjust to the context having changed around them? And unfortunately what's happened in the UK is they can't adjust because they're caught in narcissistic circles. So what I'm going to start with is, I've kind of explained a little bit, I think, about how this situation occurred. Our rule of law had kind of evolved in one way, social care, all these systems that are actually central to meeting 21st century economic challenges. Our political media didn't understand how they worked and thought they could lash out at them as a reflex response to austerity because the public wanted it. And it set off a chain of events which has led us here. Now next week what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down how Labour kind of set out to create a social movement to prevent people from participating in democracy so that this reflex could happen. In the town where I live, in the region, in the county where I live, like Calderdale Council had agreed the budgets on social care before the 2010 election. So our local Labour Party knew this. It was agreed, like National Labour Party knew this. This was agreed. There was no difference between the Labour and the Tories. With social work and systems around marginalisation and civil service systems, there is never a difference between left and right. These systems are about the rule of law and there is always political consensus on them. So what I'm going to discuss next week is from kind of 2010, I'm going to look at the social movement that Labour, the Guardian, manufactured to prevent people accessing democracy. While this policy reflex happened, I'm going to look at the role of media feminists in it. I'm going to look at people like Owen Jones, and I'm going to look at a college called Wadham College in Oxford, where I spoke at twice, which is actually the roots of the people who ended up being the Novara brats. And I'm going to look at people like Aaron Bastani, and I'm going to look at the way that this elite social movement manufactured by Labour, designed to subordinate people, led to a war in the Labour Party and led to Corbynism. And what I might put up alongside it, or I might do the week after, is a video looking very specifically at Jeremy Corbyn and the role that he and the culture that he represents played in making sure that trade unions, who should have known this, who should have known that these things weren't possible, how they used power that they gained facilitating this policy reflex, facilitating austerity, to actually subordinate people so they could carry out their own political ambitions, and have created massive instability. Now, it's really important to look at your mediating class and how they respond to something like the financial crisis, but it's important to keep in mind that at the core of it, it was government who delivered this. It was a Conservative government who delivered these policies. But what's also important to keep in mind is the British public wanted this. Austerity didn't generate 100,000 dead people in spite of us being a democracy. This happened because we are a democracy. These systems that I'm talking about that cover the rule of law for vulnerable people, the rule of law is necessary because these are people where Inequality reproduces so reliably that law is necessary. In a democracy, the democratic reflex will always be to lash out at these people, and that has been the same through history. So I am going to break down next week the structure from the point in time when they started planning their social movement, to their recruitment of vulnerable people, to the role of the Guardian, to the role of media feminists, and kind of the stuff about the Jane Austen banknote, and how this ended up with the trans rights activists who literally made it unsafe for women to organise. And I'm going to show you how this social movement was constructed from the start. And it'll either be the week after or a video alongside. I'm going to actually look at Jeremy Corbyn and the culture that he is part of, and the role that they played in providing a protective seal to prevent opposition to austerity, and how this generated the problems the country has now. Thank you very much for sticking with me today, and I will see you next Wednesday.